Silence. A man lying on the ground, blind, trembling, destroyed by a light that did not come from the earth. He heard the voice. He felt the weight. He knew that this encounter would change everything. But there's one question that almost no one asks. What if he had said no? What if, after falling, he had gotten up and returned to his old life? No mission, no letters, no churches, no impact that spanned centuries. Today you will enter one of the most profound scenarios in biblical history. It's not just about one man. It's about what happens when someone rejects the calling that heaven delivers. And before we dive into that, if this type of reflection strengthens your faith and expands your vision, please like and subscribe. This helps this message reach people who may be at the exact moment of deciding between running away or obeying. Now take a deep breath, because Paul's fall was not just a fall. It was a breaking point between two destinies. The road to Damascus seemed like just another mission. Dust beneath his feet, sun scorching the horizon, a man walking with absolute conviction that he was on the right side of history. Paul wasn't confused. He wasn't indecisive. He carried certainties as sharp as blades. In his mind, persecuting the followers of Jesus was an act of faithfulness to God. It was zeal. It was justice. And perhaps that's what makes the fall so violent. It doesn't strike a lost man, but a convinced man. Then the light tears through the sky. It's not gentle. It's not symbolic. It's a brutal interruption. The world he knew crumbles in a second. His body falls before his mind can react. The ground receives him like a mirror of his own inner ruin. And in the silence that explodes after the impact, the voice calls him by name. It's not a distant accusation. It's personal, direct, inescapable. At that moment, two destinies are born, because an encounter with the divine does not eliminate human freedom. Light reveals, but does not force. Paul could have hardened his heart. He could have clung to old certainties, like someone holding on to wreckage in the midst of a storm. I could have explained the experience as a delirium, an excess of heat, a momentary collapse. It would have been enough to get up, dust oneself off, and continue walking in the same direction. How often does life offer moments like this? Moments when the truth invades without asking permission. Situations that expose hidden cracks. Silent invitations to change course. But change demands a high price, the death of pride. And pride fights to survive. It whispers justifications. It builds defenses. It promises security in remaining. If Paul had rejected the call, the fall would have been merely a dramatic accident in a story that would have continued unchanged. He would have risen physically, but remained spiritually fallen. The light would have become an uncomfortable memory that he would have tried to bury under layers of activity and noise. And the more he tried to forget, the harder his heart would have become. Because ignoring the truth doesn't erase it. It only transforms the inner self into a field of constant tension. The road to Damascus reveals a profound principle. Every fall carries a revelation. It is not the impact that defines a man's future, but the interpretation he makes of the impact. The fall can be humiliation or birth. It can be the end of an illusion or the beginning of a mission. There, his eyes blinded by the light and his body surrendered on the ground, Paulo faces the question that separates ordinary lives from transformative stories. Will he rise to protect who he has always been, or to become who he was called to be? This is the invisible point where destinies are decided. Not before crowds, not under applause, but in the secret space between the voice that calls and the heart that answers. The road doesn't change. The sky doesn't repeat itself. What changes is the willingness to listen. Paul's fall is not just a historical event. It's a portrait of the human condition. Everyone walks with certainties. Everyone builds solid identities. And at some point, the light interrupts the journey. When that happens, there is no neutrality. Either man opens himself to transformation, or he closes himself off in defense. If he had chosen to shut himself off, history would only record the persistence of a pursuer. But by allowing the fall to shatter his certainties, he transforms the ground into an altar. The place of interruption becomes the place of beginning. And this is the truth that resonates through your experience. The greatest tragedy is not falling before the light. The greatest tragedy is seeing the light and preferring the darkness. The darkness that envelopes Paul after his fall is not merely the absence of vision. It is a forced plunge into himself. Guided by the hand of others, he enters Damascus as a man who has lost all bearings. He who once led now needs to be led. He who spoke with authority is now silent. And in this contrast, a heavy, almost palpable silence is born. 3 days. Without being able to see. Without eating. No distractions. The outside world disappears, and only the most difficult territory to traverse remains. The interior. There, in the quiet of a closed room, Paulo faces the collapse of his own identity. Every memory from the road returns like a persistent echo. The light, the voice, the ground. Nothing can be undone. Nothing can be ignored. It is in this silence that the calling begins to take real form, because intense experiences can be denied when life remains noisy. But in isolation, there is nowhere to run. Silence removes the layers of defense. It forces a man to face who he is without titles, without reputation, without social armor. Paul is no longer the feared persecutor. He is merely a blind man, sitting in darkness, confronted by a truth that dismantles his history. If he decided to reject the call, this would be the time to do so. He would only need to fuel the revolt, transform fear into anger, convince himself that it was all just a disturbance. The human heart possesses an impressive ability to rewrite events to protect pride. Paul could leave that room more rigid than when he entered, using the experience as fuel to further harden his stance. And that's what makes these 3 days so crucial. They function like a desert compressed in time, a place where old structures slowly die. The pursuer begins to perceive cracks in their convictions. The certainty that once seemed unshakable now trembles. And in this trembling there's pain, but there's also opportunity. The silence reveals an uncomfortable truth. Transformation requires surrender. It is not the light on the road that completes the work. It is the willingness to remain in the process when no one is watching. In the darkness, Paul needs to admit he was wrong. He needs to allow guilt to emerge, not to destroy him, but to prepare him. The external blindness reflects a new inner vision that is beginning to be born. If he resisted this process, he would leave the room with his eyes open, but his soul closed. The experience would become a poorly healed scar, a source of bitterness and denial. Rejecting the call would mean rebuilding the old self upon the recent ruins, like someone trying to erect a house while ignoring the flaws in the foundation. But something different happens in that silence. Hunger and darkness create space for dependency. For the first time, Paul experiences fragility without masks. And fragility, when accepted, transforms into a portal. It shatters the illusion of self-sufficiency and opens the way to a new confidence. The man who entered the room believing he controlled his own destiny begins to recognize the need to be guided. This recognition is not instantaneous. It is a silent battle, fought thought by thought. Pride resists. Memory accuses. Fear projects an uncertain future. Yet, at the heart of this conflict, a conviction grows. The voice heard on the road cannot be ignored without profound consequences. The 3 days teach us that the calling is not solidified in the spectacle of revelation, but in the intimacy of the decision. It is in the invisible space of silence that true change takes hold. Each hour spent in darkness distances Paul from his old identity and brings him closer to a new mission. When help finally arrives and his scales fall away, the visible miracle is merely a reflection of an inner miracle that has already begun. He doesn't leave the room as the same person who entered. The silence has fulfilled its purpose. It broke down resistance. It reorganized priorities. It planted the seed of conscious obedience. And that is the hallmark of these 3 days. They show that rejecting the call is always a real possibility, but accepting it requires traversing the uncomfortable territory of transformation. In the end, the silence that could have become a prison transforms into a workshop, a place where a new person begins to be shaped. When Paul breaks the silence and decides to obey, he doesn't enter a path illuminated by applause. He enters unstable territory. Obedience doesn't immediately soften life. It deepens it. The first step out of that dark room is also the first step away from the security he has always known. Saying yes to the calling means crossing a bridge that burns behind you. His former allies now regard him with suspicion. To them, Paulo has become an internal threat, a traitor to the cause he once defended with passion. At the same time, those he persecuted cannot easily trust him. His approach breeds fear. The past walks beside him, like a persistent shadow. This is the invisible cost of obedience, the period in which no one knows exactly who you are. If Paul had rejected the calling, he would have preserved a clear place in the world. He would have remained surrounded by recognition, sustained by a solid and respected identity. Predictability would have been his protection, but it would also have been his prison, because a life built solely to maintain external approval inevitably becomes narrow. By choosing to obey, he accepts living in tension. Obedience sets him in motion, and movement generates friction. Each city visited carries risks. Each word proclaimed challenges structures. He quickly discovers that following the call is not an escape from conflict, but a conscious plunge into it. Yet, within this uncertain scenario, a force is born that he has never experienced before. It's not the force of imposition. It is the power of conviction. When a man knows why he walks, obstacles change their nature. They don't disappear, but they lose their power to paralyze. Paul begins to realize that meaning sustains where comfort would fail. The difficulties that could crush him become proof that he is experiencing something greater than himself. Had he chosen to refuse, his life would have remained organized, but limited. He would have avoided persecution, imprisonment, and loss. But he would also have avoided the expansion that only risk provides. Because every true calling carries the seed of a life that transcends personal boundaries. Saying yes pulls him out of the center of his own story and inserts him into a broader narrative. This shift is disconcerting. Obeying requires relinquishing absolute control. It means accepting that the future will not be shaped solely by human plans. And this surrender is frightening. Fear whispers scenarios of failure. It questions prudence. It suggests retreat. The temptation to back down accompanies every advance. But there is something that keeps him going. The memory of the encounter. The light on the road was not just an event. It was a milestone that redefined priorities. Whenever doubt creeps in, Paul internally returns to that moment. He remembers the clarity that pierced his darkness, and that memory acts as an anchor. Obedience ceases to be an emotional impulse and becomes a decision renewed daily. This is how risk transforms into a path. Each obedient step expands his capacity to trust. He learns that courage is not the absence of fear, but movement despite it. He discovers that the calling does not eliminate vulnerability, but gives it new meaning. What once seemed like a threat becomes fertile ground for growth. Had he rejected all of that, his story would be shorter in depth, perhaps calmer on the surface, but devoid of lasting impact. Because the security that avoids risks also avoids silent miracles. It protects from failure, but prevents fulfillment. By accepting the call, Paul chooses to live exposed to continuous transformation. And in this exposure you find freedom. Not the freedom to do what is easy, but the freedom to become who you were destined to be. The risk of obedience reveals, paradoxically, the stability of a firm purpose. Ultimately, the power of yes isn't just in the visible results. It's in the internal transformation it brings about. A man who once walked guided by rigid certainties now moves forward, sustained by conscious faith. And this change redefines everything. Obedience doesn't promise the absence of storms. It promises direction in the midst of them. And for Paul, that becomes enough. A decision rarely ends in itself. It spreads. It travels. It touches places that the human eye cannot foresee. When Paul chooses to obey the call, he is not only defining his own future, he is triggering a domino effect that spans generations. Initially, this is invisible. He is just a man walking from city to city, speaking to small groups, facing resistance, planting seeds that seem too fragile to sustain any grandeur. Nothing in his routine suggests the reach his choices will have. And yet, each act of obedience pushes history a few inches forward. If Paul had rejected the call, the world would not have stopped. God's work would not have been suspended. But his participation in that construction would have been lost. And that loss would not have been merely personal. It would have been collective. Because every calling carries hidden connections to destinies that depend on that yes. Each life, touched by his words, represents a crossroads that only existed because he accepted his own. This reveals a disconcerting truth. No one lives in isolation. The most intimate decisions produce ripples that reach distant shores. When someone answers the call, they open paths for others to find direction. When they refuse, certain doors simply never come into existence. The impact of Paul's obedience is not measured solely in travels or speeches. It is measured in the formation of communities, in the consolidation of a message that transcends cultures, in the building of bridges between worlds that once seemed irreconcilable. His yes becomes language, hope, and structure for countless people. If he had chosen silence, many of these stories would have been different, or perhaps not at all. And here's the most profound point. The calling isn't just about doing something. It's about becoming someone whose very existence is an influence. Paul's life takes on a specific weight. His presence changes environments. His journey offers a reference point. He becomes living proof that transformation is possible. Rejecting the call would have preserved a lesser version of oneself. Accepting it expands one's existence until it becomes a legacy. Legacy isn't about fame. It's about continuity. It is the capacity of a life to echo after the immediate sound fades. Each letter written, each conversation held, each obedient step contributes to a current he will not live to see complete. Yet he walks on, because he understands that purpose rarely reveals its full scope to those who carry it out. This awareness changes the way he faces difficulties. Suffering ceases to be merely personal. It becomes part of a larger picture. He realizes that his choices build roads that others will walk on, and this injects meaning even into the hardest moments. The domino effect of obedience shows that a single yes can redraw entire maps, not instantaneously or spectacularly, but through consistent loyalty. Small acts repeated with conviction generate transformations that time amplifies. And this story doesn't remain confined to the past. She moves forward like a mirror before those who contemplate her. The question that arises from Paulo's journey is not historical. It is personal. Each person carries silent crossroads, moments in which life presents invitations disguised as interruptions. At these points, seemingly private decisions determine broad horizons. The legacy begins the moment of choice. And this is where the narrative closes and opens at the same time. Because the road hasn't ended. It has simply changed travelers. The same logic continues to operate. Falls that conceal invitations, silences that prepare decisions, risks that reveal purpose, choices that echo beyond the visible. Now the question no longer hangs over Paul. She leans towards him. What if the next yes is the one that redefines your story? What if the fall you fear is actually the door you silently asked for? What if the call you're avoiding holds the key to destinations that are still waiting for you? The road lies before your feet, and every road holds a spot where the sky whispers and the heart answers.